Okay, guys, we're going to get started. We've got a briefing we're going to take up first, and we've got the two presenters. We've got Tyler Abbott, Director of Land and Materials Administration at our Maryland Department of Environment. We're going to take them first, and then we've got Chris Kelleher, PhD. He's a policy analyst from the Council of State Governments Eastern Region, CSG, which we're a member of. And so with that said, I'm going to, Mr. Abbott, why don't we, where is Mr. Abbott? Yeah, you're Mr. Abbott. Okay, you could, yeah, you could use the podium, or you could just sit at the table, whichever you're mostly
Great.
Okay, well, why don't we start with you, and then are you Mr. Kelleher? Who's Mr. Kelleher? This is just, okay. Why don't you just come up to the table? You'll go after these folks are done, and then we'll do some Q&A. Okay, so Tyler, why don't you first tell us who you are, and then we'll go through your slide presentation. Okay?
Sure. I'm Tyler Abbott, Director of the Land and Materials Administration, but Director Curry is going to be leading this presentation. My name must just be first there for the alphabet. But Lee, you want to take?
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Suzanne too.
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, who's not here, sorry, members of the Education, Energy, Environment Committee. For the record, I'm Deputy Secretary Suzanne Dorsey on behalf of Secretary McElwain, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to address PFAS in Maryland. With me today, as you just discussed, is the Director of Land and Materials Administration, that's Tyler Abbott, and the Director of the Water and Science Administration, that's Director Lee Curry. So just to begin, I want to mention that Maryland is taking a leading role in protecting the public from this emerging toxin PFAS. We're actively communicating to the public. Like recently, we hosted meetings with river keepers, watermen, and other interested party about fish consumption advisories in coordination with the Maryland Department of Health. And thanks to the George Walter Taylor Act, the department submitted an action plan last year. Nationally, globally, scientists continue to expand their understanding of the distribution and potential harms associated with this family of compounds. But MDE has not waited. We have taken action with the available information and working with our sister agencies, with legislators, advocates, and stakeholders. Our agency has taken concrete steps to protect all Marylanders. So I want to thank Directors Curry and Abbott and allow you to go ahead and provide more details. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, I'm Lee Curry. I'm Director of the Water and Science Administration at Maryland Department of the Environment. All right, just to start with some key points. These follow what Deputy Secretary Dorsey also mentioned. First is we are committed to ensure that every community has access to clean drinking water, number one. Number two is that we follow a data and science-driven process to really understand and then reduce the risk to Marylanders. And while PFAS, based on what we've learned and the data we've collected, is pervasive in the environment, the risk is not high everywhere, but it is high in certain areas. And where we have found elevated levels, we are taking action or have taken action in those areas. With respect to some of the work that's being done, the federal infrastructure funds have played a critical role, especially for our public water systems, which serve about 90% of Marylanders. The absence of a regulatory standard for drinking water and also a maximum contaminant level, as well as Director Abbott will talk about, a hazardous substance definition does create some challenges. I also want to note that Maryland's action plan that describes what we're doing in terms of what's ongoing, what gaps remain, and again, what remains to be started. So that plan was submitted back in December. What are PFAS? It's a group of about 7,000 man-made compounds. What made it good in terms of manufacturing? It was heat resistant, flame retardant, oil and grease resistant, water resistant, all these great things that made it fantastic in manufacturing, but makes it very difficult to deal with in the environment, especially being heat resistant in terms of trying to break it down. It does not break down easily in the environment, and it persists in the environment. The exposure risks related to PFAS, it's mostly through ingestion. So, or all through ingestion. So it's not topical, for example. So if one is drinking water or one is breathing in some type of dust that has PFAS in it, what this shows you is some of those exposure risks. We put the first one on the left, which is the top left, which is your exposure through drinking contaminated water. And to keep in mind, when EPA was looking at and has looked at setting their regulatory thresholds, they assume that any individual, their exposure through drinking water is about 20%, meaning about 80% is coming from other sources. Second is eating fish caught from the bay or other areas. So for example, it could have elevated levels of PFAS, and I'm going to talk more about that later. And the rest talk about other sources that could occur through ingestion. So the health risks, there's a variety of health risks that scientists have put together. One is high cholesterol, if you look at the top left, all the way to the increased risk of kidney or testicular cancer. So it does have health impacts, and it has health impacts at very low levels of PFAS. I also want to note, though, that the health impacts are not acute, they're chronic. So it's looked at over a long period of time. That's not to say it's any less. I just want to characterize it's that the health risk is based on looking at exposure over multiple decades. When we look nationally in terms of what we know across the country, there has been some information that was put together going back to the late 1999 period, looking forward into all the way up to about 2017, 2018. What that figure on the right is illustrating is the level of PFAS, PFOS and PFOA, the two most commonly studied compounds of PFAS. It shows the levels in blood levels in individuals across the nation. And you can see going back to 1999, levels are very high, especially for one particular substance, which is PFOS. And there were some voluntary efforts throughout with the industry in terms of reducing that and taking that out of production. And you can see when they looked at blood levels over time, you see upwards of almost an 80% decrease. So that's good news. But as you can see, it did not decrease down to zero. And as I had mentioned before, health effects do occur at very low levels of PFAS. So one thing I didn't mention before is while there are many compounds, PFOS, PFAS, and PFOA are the two most commonly studied. One of the reasons that they're most commonly studied is they're also referred to as terminus products, meaning that many forms of PFAS will turn into or change into PFOS and PFOA. Not all of them will, but that's one of the reasons that these two were most commonly studied and commonly found. Maryland's goals, again, this is a collaborative approach when looking at PFAS. It's really an all hands on deck across all of our agencies, looking at whether it's Department of Health, who we're working closely with, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Agriculture. We meet on a monthly basis, and we have been for several years, just to really make progress and understand the issues surrounding PFAS. Our process is really driven by 3 points. One is to understand the risk, and that's a data-driven process, science-based. Two is once we have that information, communicating that to the public so they know what the risk is. And then finally, and the most important piece, one of the most important pieces is reducing that risk, making sure that when we find elevated levels and there is a risk, that we take action. Some key reports and plans that we put together over the years. One in October 2020, or October of 2020, that's when we really started a large scale monitoring effort across Maryland. Our plan itself, we put it together. We pulled together about 20 experts across the nation, scientists related to PFAS. We asked them, hey, are there any holes in our plan? Is there something that we should be considering that we're not? And there were. So we added, for example, looking in Maryland, certain fish species. So we looked at oysters because they're important to us. And we also looked at blue crabs and we collected data on blue crabs. We also included biosolids, which are the solids from our wastewater treatment plants into our design. We collected a lot of data over a 2 or 3 year period, really monitoring all of our community drinking water systems. That information is captured in reports. Then in 2022, last year, we submitted a chemicals, really our monitoring report to the General Assembly. And as I mentioned, this past year, we completed an action plan, which you should have a copy of also, that was submitted to the General Assembly, talking about what we've done, what we're currently doing, and what we need to do. We have worked with our Department of Health, who has set up a nationally recognized laboratory for monitoring, or not monitoring, but for testing for perfluorinated compounds, PFAS. So it was, again, a great effort there, and they've really increased our capacity to collect a lot of information across the state. So let me start with public water systems. So our community water systems, they serve about 90% of people in Maryland. There's about more than 400 of those systems. We have monitored all of those systems. So the question is, well, what are we finding? Well, out of those systems, we have found 63 systems that exceed what is the Environmental Protection Agency's draft regulatory threshold. EPA has not finalized their threshold yet, but we're using that draft threshold as a guideline in terms of what is high and what's an acceptable level. So 63 out of those roughly 437 systems, we found elevated levels. When we first started this, we took the first 5 systems, which had higher levels at the time, above what EPA had at the time as a health advisory level, and we found alternate sources of water for those 5 systems. In the past year, through the infrastructure funds, we have connected these systems with funding. We connected 14 of those 63 systems with funding, and I think the funding totaled about more than $40 million. Now, an important part of this is in connecting these community systems with money. It's not about just having the money, it's actually helping them get the money. Some of these are smaller communities, environmental justice communities, and we built bridges to them through some non-governmental organizations to help them capture this money. So, but we are proud of the fact that we just recently awarded, again, over 40 million to help solve this problem, at least 14 of these systems. The EPA proposed maximum contaminant levels are at a very low level. I just put this on here for reference. And EPA is planning they were to finalize their drinking water threshold, the regulatory threshold, in late December 2023. They have not yet. We understand it should be early or sometime in the first quarter of 2024. This gives you an indication of what it looks like across the state from our monitoring information. Each of those dots represent a sample that's collected from one of our public water systems. The green dots are basically, we didn't detect any PFAS. If you see a dot that has a color, it's detected, and it's detected at various levels. And anywhere there's a dot that's yellow, orange, or red, it's above that current EPA regulatory threshold. This gets at those 63 systems I was talking about. If you look at this map, there's also a pattern to this. So here's what we know. One is if you look at the I-95 corridor and you look west of that corridor, you can see that's where you're finding some elevated levels, and it's based on the geology, the soils in that area. That's one of the reasons for that. Notice in the southeast portion of the bay, southwest portion of the bay, you're seeing a lot of green dots. We're not finding elevated levels. There is a reason for that. One is the drinking water in that area comes from deep confined aquifers where our water is stored, and there's no pathway of exposure to those. So that's why some of those areas in that lower portion are so protected. So again, I just want to emphasize the part we are finding elevated levels. They're not everywhere, but they are in certain regions. We understand why, and we're taking action to make sure that those problems are fixed. Private wells. Again, an important part of our drinking water network. They serve about 10% or almost 1 million of our population. Private wells currently aren't regulated under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. So our approach in Maryland has really been source driven. Where we know there's a potential source, and Director Abbott will talk about this, in just a little bit, where there's a potential source, there is a potentially responsible party, and that we can use that approach to collect information and work with that potentially responsible party to solve some of those problems there. But again, private wells are not regulated. It's really the homeowner's responsibility for maintenance, continued maintenance and testing. They are regulated in terms of when they're constructed, but the monitoring afterward, there's no requirement for additional monitoring afterwards. We've also tried to educate that community, working with Department of Health and local health departments to put together a fact sheet that describes what is PFAS, understand what the options are for remediating the concerns. We also collected data across the Chesapeake Bay and the tributaries, sampling our fish to understand what we're seeing in fish. Only one compound was really accumulating in fish. It was PFAS. So what we did, we developed fish consumption advisories. An advisory is basically how much someone can eat. We did not have any do not eat advisories for PFAS. Good news is we did not find PFAS when we did a study for oysters. We didn't find it in oysters, and we didn't find levels of concern in blue crabs. But we are finding it in certain fish in certain regions. So there were 73 different advisories issued. Keep in mind, an advisory is also looking at how much someone could eat over their lifetime or multiple decades. Many times it's looking at 4 meals per month as a threshold. So I'm just want to put some context to that. So all this information is available online.
Alrighty, so to introduce myself again, I'm Tyler Abbott, I'm Director of the Land and Materials Administration here at the Department of the Environment. And part of my program is the Land Restoration Program, where I get to oversee remedial investigations. And one of those hot topic areas is for military installations. So military installations throughout history have used firefighting foams. Firefighting foams are known sources of PFAS contaminants, and it's actually one of the main ones that we have in Maryland. So we can almost guarantee that we need to do investigations at all of our military installations. Luckily, the federal government has provided us money to do these investigations, with all of them being initiated and some of them also being finished already. The result of these investigations is generally, groundwater pump and treat, or also looking at the surrounding neighbors around those facilities. But I do note at the bottom that with the current, status of PFAS contaminants, it makes it a little bit hard for us to require the federal government to address PFAS at, higher levels or at lower levels. And so when it comes to military installations, the federal government still uses that 90 PPT health advisory level from the EPA. We do know that that level is going to be decreasing, but until then, it's hard to hold them accountable for more, as well as once chemicals become listed as hazardous substances, we have other things that start kicking up in our laws or within RCRA. Oh man, I know I just used the acronym, but I don't want to butcher the actual name of it. Go to the next slide.
Sure. And I know we've talked about the levels of PFAS, parts per trillion, a lot of different numbers. One way to put that into context is EPA originally in 2016 had a health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion. So if you think about $70, they then lowered that with their draft regulatory level of 4 parts per trillion. So you compare that to $4, just to kind of put that in perspective, how that's changed. They also have an interim level that describes what is the minimum health effects that they're finding. And that level was published by EPA, and that's like looking at pennies, just to kind of put that into some perspective. Wastewater treatment plants, we have looked at our wastewater treatment plants and prioritized the way we do all of our efforts by looking at risk. And we have monitored more than 100 facilities. The way we prioritize for facilities, so we looked at a wastewater plant that has what we call a significant industrial upstream user. So that means it has some industry coming into the facility itself. So we prioritize that for monitoring. We also looked across the state at facilities that were either using biosolids for land application. These are basic biosolids, or the solids that come from a wastewater treatment plant. The way a plant works is you have liquids and solids flowing into it. You have clean water coming out of it, and then the solids are separated out and trying to use them productively. So what we did is we monitored what was flowing in, what was flowing out, and what was in the solids. What we're looking for is, when we look at all of our treatment plants, we're looking to see if there's a background level of PFAS at these plants, and we're looking for a spike, meaning that there's one that seems to be an anomaly given, and that would be a signal that there is a potential source. So that's our approach. And where there is a source, the idea is to do a source track down effort and go upstream. That municipality, that facility would begin working upstream to figure out where that source is coming from. I believe we have 14 different facilities under permits right now that have requirements for monitoring for PFAS, and if they are finding elevated levels, to have a source track down study. And I don't know if you covered the last point.
And so I received the biosolids program as part of my administration, and we, as this study is ongoing and as we're collecting data, we wanted to make sure out of an abundance of caution that we weren't putting, additional farmland at any kind of jeopardy. So we had a temporary hold on new land application permits for biosolids. So it wasn't that we just completely stopped the whole division. We just were processing up until the end, and we were holding final authorization until we could have a better idea of how, higher levels of PFAS might impact biosolids being spread on land in Maryland. We hope to have additional information coming out in the near future on what we plan to do with those applications, but we just want to make sure that we have a full risk assessment of, what kind of impact that could play.
Pesticides, working with our state agency, sister agency, Department of Agriculture. A study was submitted to the General Assembly back in November of last year. And what it described was the need to develop more reliable testing methods as it relates to pesticides. In the department, we have a permit for pesticide applications that would be on or around waters of the state. So we're looking to take the information from the 2023 report, the information that is developed in terms of new testing methods, and that permit, that pesticide permit, is due to be updated or revised in 2025. So we want to build that information into that new permit.
All right, product bans. I know a lot of you here do know about product bans regarding PFAS as you passed them. But just to touch on them at a high level, so there was legislation that passed the sale, use, manufacturing of rugs and carpets that contain PFAS, as well as restrictions on food packaging having any intentionally added PFAS as part of the manufacturing process. There was public notification to manufacturers and other entities. We had a lot of inquiries, and I think everyone was relatively satisfied in the end. And I think that it has stuck. We have a national group that we sit on where we actually partner with all the other states who have been continually doing testing on food packaging, so that we have more or less a national register of products that are high, so that we know what to be on the lookout for. And the last part, there was another bill that banned the use of firefighting foams that contain PFAS, as well as turnout gear for firefighters that have intentionally added PFAS. And we were lucky enough to get a firefighting foam take-back program that is currently in the works. We should have that released relatively soon. We have $500,000 in order to take back firefighting foams and dispose of them properly. Since the bill passed, as you might understand, the regulatory environment for the destruction of PFAS compounds has significantly increased. So we might have to have future conversations about how we're going to address all of the disposal.
Air emissions, this is an area that we're continuing to learn more about. And again, I mentioned through ingestion, that's one of the mechanisms for exposure. So there's over 2,000 commercial industrial facilities. We recognize atmospheric deposition when it lands on the ground and it rains. There could be some contamination to groundwater. But this, again, this is an area, newer area for us. We have resources dedicated to it, and we're continuing to look into what this potential source could be and how it relates to maybe background levels that we're finding in certain areas of the state. Finally, going back to where we started with this, laying out the key points here. One is we are committed to make sure and to take action to make sure that every community has access to clean drinking water. And to do that, it is a data-driven and science-driven process that is followed up with actions, especially within the public water systems and across the wastewater plants and the variety of actions that Tyler referred to. We do prioritize, we're looking at, we can't do everything at one time, but we look to where is the highest risk. That's how we started our monitoring information, where we thought the highest risk was. When we collected our data, we knew where the highest risk areas were. And that's what drives where we go first and how we use the funding that's been provided to us or the actions that were taken when there's a possible source. And that the federal infrastructure money, as I'd mentioned, does play a critical role. And over the 5-year period of those funds, there should be more than $100 million available to us. As we mentioned, the absence of a federal regulatory standard has created some unique challenges. Whether it's the standard for drinking water, it's the standard for hazardous materials. But I think we've been able to, successfully move through a lot of those challenges. But we are looking forward to EPA's decisions related to its regulatory standards. Then finally, the plan that we submitted to you back in late 2023 describes in much more detail what we went through today. Again, it describes the actions, the data we've collected, the actions that we've taken, where we've started but haven't quite finished yet. And then there are certain areas that we haven't started yet that need some additional attention that we've identified. So with that, I really appreciate your time.
Okay, well, thank you.
and
That was
Appreciate questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll open up to questions. I guess, some of us are new to this topic. I'll just be candid. We did have one session. And so when I'm looking at your PowerPoint, when I see, and can you just play just for a lay legislator here on this one, 7,000 human-made compounds fit within the definition of PFAS. That seems so huge. And then on the one hand, I know we've got medical devices, electronics, semiconductors that has some PFAS component. And yet then I look at your other slide, you're talking about and those don't seem to have any exposure kind of risk situation. Those are not in a category where there's causes alarms. But then I look at your other PowerPoint, it's about rugs, carpets. What else is on your food packaging? Mm-hmm. Okay, just for my edification, like what are the differences between the stuff we don't worry about exposure wise and these other thousands of compounds that we do, because they're all lumped under PFAS. So I just want to get a handle on that in my mind.
Senator, thank you. I appreciate that question. And I'll just start by saying, I don't think we don't worry about it. I think that it's not under MDE's regulatory purview. So what you heard today was really what is under our regulatory purview, if that makes sense.
And I would add to that, as I mentioned early on, we do know that there are some terminus chemicals, meaning that some convert into this form. So there is that piece of it. And I think there's a lot that we do know, but there's a lot that we need to continue to learn and a lot of work that needs to go into continuing to understand that. So I appreciate your question.
Yeah, concern. Just 7,000 compounds. Sure. I wonder if it could be refined to component parts that are maybe a little bit more understandable, but that's just kind of me talking. Okay, Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Chair. Just one quick question on page 18, that slide you listed. It says over 2,000 commercial and industrial facilities are potential sources. So is that just for the state of Maryland? And how did you come up with that figure? I don't see a source on here. So
I believe that is just for the.
I believe that number is for the state, and that comes from just a overall view of how many air permits that there are.
Right.
Not specific PFAS risks within that facility, but just as we're trying to understand the risks of PFAS in air emissions, that would be your regulatory environment.
And to compare it back when we started looking at drinking water, we looked at all the potential sources, military installations, wastewater plants, and we didn't know if it was a source or not, but that's how we helped prioritize our monitoring. So I think this is something similar. We're starting with the universe and then trying to trim that down.
There are reports from other states that look at the more or less airshed around manufacturing facilities of actual PFAS compounds. And so that is being studied. We don't have manufacturers of the compounds in Maryland, but we want to learn more about how our neighboring states could affect us too.
Okay, we've got Senator Brooks and then Carosa and then Hester. So Senator Brooks, you're first.
All right, thanks, Chair. Yeah, quick question. When did PFAS started becoming an issue, coming on the scene as being a problem?
It's a tough question. So we are currently in a couple different pieces of state litigation to figure out when people exactly found out that this was an issue. But when you look at it from the state regulatory environment of when we started taking additional actions and when it started being brought up at the EPA level, I think that if you're looking at 2018, 2019 is when, and then our work started a little bit heavier in the 2020s. So it was identified, and I think that the risks were a little bit perceived to be more limited. And then once we found that, different studies were coming out and we realized those health impacts, it really ramped up the kind of work that we were doing at all regulatory levels.
Okay, and what would you say the greatest threat to society from PFAS today?
Sure. I
What'd you
want to
say?
turn the lead.
We are really focused on the health impacts and reducing all Marylanders' exposure to the health outcomes associated with these chemicals. There's a lot of questions that we have remaining about what their impact is to the environment, but our focus right now is primarily public health.
But I guess just to add slightly more specific too, our largest focus currently has been on drinking water as your exposure pathway, as it's a persistent point of exposure.
I went back and I looked at life expectancy in the U.S. over the past, say, 150 years, where back in 1870, they expected your life expectancy was about 40 years, and today is 83. So, somehow it seemed like that expectancy rate has been going up, in spite of PFAS.
Mhm.
So could you perhaps speak to that?
Oh, I don't know if any of us want to opine on health information.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not a public health, I'm not a doctor or medical professional, but I am aware that our medical profession has had many breakthroughs, awareness about eating right, exercising, all of that. All of that has contributed to our expanding lifespan. Again, speaking as a non-expert. But we're also aware that there are additional threats, and those threats can cause increased risks associated with chronic diseases. And that affects not just our longevity, but the quality of our lives. So we want to make sure that all families in Maryland have the best chance by having access to clean air, clean land, and clean water.
Okay. All right, thanks, Chair.
Okay, Senator Carosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Deputy Secretary Dorsey and the team for your follow-up on some of the constituent issues and challenges that we brought your way. I have two quick questions. One, under the wastewater treatment plant slide, where I just wanted to better understand the bullet point about land application of biosolids policy. I'm trying to understand what that would mean for my constituents. And then under pesticides, same question, just trying to translate this and what it might mean to our constituents.
Sure. So as part of the policy, we put a temporary hold on new land application permits for biosolids. Biosolids are frequently used in farming operations for farms of non-human consumption, and it is a cost-effective nutrient source. We currently just want to understand the impacts of PFAS in biosolids, as well as have a better understanding of the levels of PFAS and biosolids across the state. And so this current policy is more so just to make sure that, we're not putting new farms at risk who historically have not received any biosolids onto their properties, just in case we find, bad information, that nothing has to happen to that new farm.
So
So I'm just trying to understand, it's on hold or?
So they're currently on hold for that final authorization. So my team is doing all the research behind it. My team is doing stakeholder engagement. They're working on finalizing that permit. I'm just not signing it yet.
So Senator, our priority is both to protect the public health, but also to protect our farmers and their land. So working collaboratively with our farming community to make sure that they have the tools to keep farming forever, if that's their choice.
And I do understand that. I'm just trying to understand the hold on the new permits. How many how many are we talking? Do we know statewide? Do we know by district?
I don't have by district. I could help come up with a number for your district. I believe that there are around 60 permits on hold currently.
Yeah, just trying to get a sense of it.
Trying to get,
And
understand.
then on the pesticide slide, just looking at that information, how that also translates back home.
Yeah, so that's what we're doing. We're looking at the information right now and trying to understand how it's going to shape or affect that permit. We haven't concluded that review yet. But we do know and have through the literature identify that there can be PFAS in certain pesticides. So we're just looking at how does that relate to what would be conditions in a permit, and that permit's due to be completed in 2025.
Do you want to talk about what that permit covers?
Yeah, and that permit would cover applications of pesticides near or on around waters of the state. So think about mosquito spraying would be one example.
There's not a list now, it's under review, and then depending what the results of the review might dictate next steps. Is that?
That's correct. We
Okay.
haven't even we haven't even started any of the public comment process. So what we would do is once we're complete that review, we would let stakeholders know, like, here's what we're finding. And then, of course, go through the formal public comment process related to what we found in that permit, because that would be the general permit that covers a variety of permittees or.
And that's helpful
Yeah.
just to kind of know when to,
Sure.
expect that information will go out to our constituents and the feedback. So thank you.
Yes, and we would definitely reach out to the industry first.
Okay, before we go to Hester, just real quick, are there any MDE departmental bills on PFAS likely to be coming in? I don't think I've seen anything, but just curious.
No.
Okay, Senator Hester.
Thank you. And I want to thank you all for working with me over the interim to understand some of this information. My first question is on slide 10. So where you say that there's 63 systems exceed maximums, is that the proposed maximums or the old maximums?
That's the proposed maximum, the 4 parts per trillion. So 63 systems exceed either 4 parts per trillion for PFOS or PFOA.
Okay. And so then there's a delta of 49 that have not yet been awarded funding.
That's right.
What are the plans for those 49?
So we're working with those systems also, because what happens first is we work with each of those communities to identify, one, is there an alternate source nearby? So could they connect to another public water system that is PFAS free? The second one would be could they drill their well deeper? Could they change it around in some way? Or maybe some of these systems have multiple wells and they could shut one well off and that would be fine. So we try to use those solutions first, and then finally go to treatment would be the last solution, because that would require maintenance. Now, what we're doing right now is we worked with those first 14, and then we're working with additional systems, because as we awarded more than $40 million, there's still $80 million remaining over the next 3 years. So we're trying to connect those systems with the money to solve the problem.
So is that $80 million, was that given from the federal government to the state of Maryland?
It was, yes, it
And-
came out of the infrastructure funds.
That's fabulous. And so do you think that 80 million, you said, so we spent 40 million on 14 systems. We've got 80 million for 49 systems. Is that going to be enough to solve the problem?
We'll know more when we get through them, but probably not. There will probably need to be additional funding that would be needed.
Could you provide us with a list of the systems and their location and their levels?
Sure, we can do that. And we can provide you with a list of the systems that have been funded also.
That would be great. I think
Yeah.
that would help. I
Yeah.
think personally, if there were some in my district, I would want to know about them.
Sure.
Um,
And just so you have the numbers, we issued we awarded, sorry, it was not 14, 13 community water systems for $46 million. And through federal fiscal year 2026, there's $125 million available from two funds. One is the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the second one is related to the small and disadvantaged communities grant program.
that's awesome. So
And
there's
the-
126 million left,
125 total.
125 total.
So subtract 46 off. So there's about, almost 75, 80 million left.
Okay, sorry.
And that is just in the specific BIL funding that addresses PFAS, because we also have additional funding sources within the department, either it be grants or loans to address these as well.
Right. And that would be through the state revolving funds. So that could be a loan program to solve the problem.
Thank you. My next question is on slide 14. This has to do with the military sites.
Sure.
And I heard, I heard what you were saying about, it's hard sometimes to work with the federal government. Have you tried engaging with the federal delegation? Like our congressmen and our senators, just to see if they can help? Because I imagine we have more military sites than some other places do. And
Let me start, Tyler.
Sure.
Yeah, we have a variety of contact points with our DoD facilities, so we do utilize all of our connections. We have liaisons associated with them. Again, I think one of the challenges that the directors face there is that these federal facilities won't or can't, let's just say can't, because I think they can't act unless there are federal regulations that they can tie to. So we are interested in continuing to have conversations with our federal delegations to push those regulatory tools that we need in Maryland to support your constituents.
my next question, it kind of has to do with it was, slide 18, we were talking about air emissions, but my question is about like water emissions. So do we have any direct discharge that comes from industry to the treatment plants? And do those require a permit?
We don't have any manufacturers.
No, we don't have any manufacturers of PFAS within Maryland. So there's no one manufacturing it and then it's flowing through their being discharged from their facility. Within our municipal wastewater treatment plants, there are, for example, wastewater plants that accept water from an industry. And that's what we're trying to find out. Would that industry happen to have not manufacturing PFAS, but could PFAS be part of a product that they're using in their industry itself?
And
So when you list on page 36 of the action plan,
Mhm.
You talk about metal finishing, electroplating, landfills, pulp paper, leather tanning, plastics, textile mills, paint formulating, and airports. Are those the industries where you're thinking that there might be PFAS coming from them, or is it broader than that?
so, do you want me to- yeah, yep, sure. So those would be the industries that we're highlighting as those of interest. Also, if you're looking at just the whole broad picture, also of interest would be sites where you've had historic large fires that firefighting foams might have been needed to be used. We're certainly trying to figure out all of the potential sources, and as part of the overall plan on how we're going to address wastewater treatment plants and biosolids, a big part of that too is source tracking. And so not just looking at what's coming out of the back end of the wastewater treatment plant, but all those different sources of what's coming into the wastewater treatment plant, because getting it out of the wastewater treatment plant in the first place is going to be our cheapest way to, address elevated PFAS levels.
So looking at that list, yes. So for example, landfills, there's leachate from a landfill. Sometimes that goes to a wastewater treatment plant. That was prioritized on our list to collect data so we understand what's happening in that plant itself.
So when you talked about the source tracking, so if you've got a waste, we've got however many it was, 60 some treatment plants that have these higher elevations, and then you start to track the sources. So what happens when you find the source?
Well, let me separate that out. So the 63 are water treatment plants.
Okay,
So that's related to drinking water. And then what we're doing is looking at, as it comes from communities, you have the wastewater that comes from communities and possibly from industry, and it goes into a municipal wastewater treatment plant. We have collected data from those wastewater plants, and what we're looking for is to see if we look at multiple plants, do we see more or less a background level, because PFAS is pervasive in the environment, and are we seeing at a certain facility a spike, something a little bit different than the other ones? And if we see that spike, that's a good indication that maybe there's a source, and that entity would then start a source tracking program by beginning to look upstream.
And just to finish that thought, Senator, once the source is identified, particularly if they have a permit, we would control the release of that substance in that permit.
okay, this is what I wanted to get to. What are those permits called?
They're pre-treatment permits.
The pre-treatment permits.
Yes.
So, and I think this is on page 6 of the action plan. If applicable, coordination with the industrial pre-treatment program will be required to address industrial facilities discharging PFAS into the sanitary sewer system. So it says it was started in 2021 and it's kind of in progress.
Right.
So do these companies have pre-industrial treatment permits which say that they can discharge PFAS?
The pre-treatment permits at this time don't specifically speak to PFAS.
I see. So we've got pre-industrial. So can you just describe like what this permit does? Does it, I mean, I'm picturing like a random factory with a discharge pipe, and they've got a permit and you're testing for some things, but right now it does not include, they're not treating for PFAS. Just like if you had an incinerator, you had an air stack, you had a scrubber, there's some kind of scrubber on the water, but that scrubber is not checking for PFAS.
It's like a separate industry, right? So we would have an industry that would have a discharge, so they have some type of treatment process for the industry. They would have a discharge, and that discharge, instead of being discharged into a water body, it would go straight into a pipe that goes down to a wastewater treatment plant, a municipal wastewater treatment plant. So that pre-treatment permit would cover what's coming from that industrial facility itself. And that part of the reason for the pre-treatment permit is to look at, one, are there any potentially harmful chemicals coming in to both the environment, and also municipal facility doesn't want chemicals coming in and disrupting the treatment process in that municipal facility, because sometimes they're biological processes and you don't want all the bugs in the system to die.
If I may add to it, this is an emerging toxin, and I'm going to ask a question. Hopefully that will answer your question. Is it fair to say that moving forward, pre-treatment permits will include considerations around PFAS?
Yeah, I would say yes, because we're looking at it for wastewater plants, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to go upstream and figure out what would be, is there a potential source upstream? So we should be able to detect it downstream, and then we can find it and enforce it in the permit upstream.
So would the appropriate pre-treatment permit discharge level be the same as what's appropriate at the wastewater treatment plant?
Yeah, I'm not sure at this point. I mean, this is also the challenge in the absence of a regulatory threshold, just mentioning. And two is if we do see a spike downstream, we would then, what we're doing right now is we're having the municipality put together a source track down plan. And if they find the source, we're going to require them to treat it or to work with that source to eliminate or reduce PFAS. Because the consequence is if they can't eliminate it upstream, they'll likely have to eliminate it downstream. And it's going to be a lot more costly downstream.
Right. So it's a question of whether the company with the industrial permit pays to clean up the water, or it comes to our municipality and the municipalities have to clean it up.
Right.
Okay, I think that answers that question.
So yes,
Do-
we would put it in a pretreatment permit if necessary.
That's
Do you
all I
want to touch
have,
on
Mr.
that
Chair.
process? Nah,
No.
Okay, any additional questions for this panel? We do have our council state government's national perspective, what's happening in other states. We're going to get to him. And thank you to the MDE team for the presentation. We appreciate it. And next we are going to go to, we've got our representative from CSG, Chris Kelleher, PhD, policy analyst for the Council of State Governments Eastern Region. Chris, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it. You've got a PowerPoint too, and you're going to give us a bit of a overview from where you guys sit. You can have give a perspective nationally, what other states are doing and that kind of thing. So I'm going to turn it to you to do your thing, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you, Chair Feldman. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. We at CSG East are always happy to be here in Maryland, visiting our colleagues and friends. But I am here today to provide this committee with an overview of current PFAS regulatory efforts at both the federal and state levels. So in 2023, we saw both the federal government and state governments move to address PFAS, or so-called forever chemicals. Now, at the federal level, the Environmental Protection Agency has continued to make progress on its PFAS Strategic Roadmap, which is a 4-year plan to research, restrict, and remediate PFAS, which was first issued by the EPA Council on PFAS in October of 2021, and which is now, in 2024, approaching its conclusion. And then at the state level in 2023, we saw numerous states enact bills that acted generally to do one of 3 things. That was ban certain products that contain PFAS, appropriate funds to remediate PFAS, or create studies to examine the issue further. So in what follows, I will begin laying out the federal government's current efforts to regulate PFAS as outlined in the EPA Strategic Roadmap, including the EPA's approach and goals, key roadmap actions, and cross-program interagency collaborations, before then moving on to provide an overview of what various states have either introduced or enacted as part of their respective efforts to regulate PFAS. So in April of 2021, it was then EPA Administrator Michael Reagan who established the EPA Council on PFAS. Shortly thereafter, the council developed what would come to be called the PFAS Strategic Roadmap, which was then released to the public in October later that year. Now, in essence, and at the time, the roadmap represented a whole of EPA approach to protect public health and the environment from PFAS. Now, included in the roadmap are timelines for concrete actions for the EPA to take between 2021 and 2024, a plan for filling critical gaps in federal leadership for regulating PFAS, a plan for supporting states' ongoing efforts to regulate PFAS, and a plan to build on the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to, as the roadmap puts it, restore scientific integrity. So there's a certain approach or methodology that the EPA takes in fulfilling these goals that it set out for itself. And this is what the EPA calls a PFAS life cycle approach to understanding the science and impacts of PFAS as well as regulating them. Now, this approach entails considering the life cycle of PFAS in terms of ecosystems, water precipitation cycles, and manufacturing processes, getting what they call upstream of the problem in terms of implementing forensic tracking processes that are able to trace PFAS to their sources, holding polluters accountable, and that is to say developing best practice enforcement mechanisms that balance industry needs with public health and consumer and community safety, ensuring empirical science-based decision-making, and then finally prioritizing the protection of disadvantaged communities especially those least equipped in terms of resources to mitigate the health and environmental impacts of PFAS. Ultimately, this approach and these aims are to achieve the EPA's 3 goals, or the 3 Rs that they refer to it in their roadmap. The first is research. And by this, they mean to invest in research, development, and innovation to increase understanding of methods for measuring PFAS in the environment, assessing the associated human health and environmental risks, and evaluating and developing technologies for reducing the accumulation of PFAS in the environment. The second R is to restrict. Now, this involves pursuing a comprehensive approach to proactively preventing PFAS from entering air, land, and water at levels that can adversely impact human health in the environment. And then finally, the EPA aims to remediate, which is to say they aim to broaden and accelerate the cleanup of PFAS contamination to protect human health and ecological systems. Now, at first, the EPA sought to undertake what they called a whole of EPA approach. So by this, they meant they wanted to engage directly with affected communities, and that included conducting interviews with certain socioeconomically targeted communities and soliciting feedback on proposed regulations. Currently, they still have model regulations and model rules open for public feedback and criticism as well, and also public comment. They also want to use enforcement tools and forensic chemistry to identify and address PFAS releases in the environment. They want to continue to report on EPA's progress and communicate PFAS risks, and also coordinate with federal partners on policy strategies. So by 2024, that whole of EPA approach has now become a whole of government approach. In implementing this approach, what they mean to do is secure interagency policy committees on PFAS, and they've done this with the Council on Environmental Quality, and then put together a PFAS R&D strategy team, which is currently housed under the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Ultimately, with these efforts, they aim to improve things like reducing PFAS in federal procurement among government agencies. Now, the EPA has also made clear that among other end goals, including developing more robust regulations to designate more varieties of PFAS as hazardous substances, and crucially, their ultimate aim is to regulate PFAS as a class of chemicals and not regulate each individual chemical by itself. They also aim to build a technical foundation for potential Clean Air Act regulations down the line, for ultimately regulating PFAS that have been found in the air. Again, to date, the EPA is still only the EPA is still in the stages of developing a series of best practices for states as well as guidance as they continue to research the issue and solicit feedback on proposed rules and guidelines for PFAS. And as we heard in the previous presentation, they are a bit behind schedule on making key decisions for setting rules, regulations, and standards. So with the time left, I next want to turn to current and ongoing efforts by states to regulate PFAS, and with a particular emphasis on the Eastern region, and with a view toward how much further along states are, especially in the Eastern region, in comparison to the kind of baseline policy the federal government has set out to establish. So you might, in various discussions of PFAS regulations, hear about the different buckets that legislation can fall into. I'm here calling these categories instead. But of the existing proposed, introduced, or passed legislation aiming to address PFAS in some way, bills tend to do one of 3 things while falling under the following categories. Bans, appropriating funds to remediate PFAS, or creating studies to further examine the issue, as I stated at the beginning. Now, under those broad categories, here are the subcategories or buckets that you might hear. So the first is firefighting equipment, especially firefighting foam that we heard, drinking and groundwater, manufacturing, agriculture, commercial and consumer products, healthcare, pesticides, and then there are certain miscellaneous bills that have come out within the past year dealing with end of life, and leachate. Well, I don't have all of the time to go through what each state has done pertaining to each category. You can see, and these are just from the past year, different bills that have come out pertaining to either firefighting equipment, drinking and groundwater. Of note this past year, while Maine and of course Maryland have certainly led the way, we have perhaps seen the greatest variety of PFAS legislation emerging from Massachusetts. Some of their bills included establishing a PFAS agricultural relief fund in Senate Bill 39, as well as a PFAS remediation trust fund to mitigate the cost to public health associated with PFAS. They also introduced multiple bills, creating commissions to study the issue further, a bill requiring the disclosure of toxic chemicals in children's products, and a voucher program for home water filtration equipment. New Hampshire has also sought to establish a grant program for PFAS blood testing and one to provide testing for PFAS in private water wells. Maine has also taken an even-handed approach in seeking to establish resources for manufacturers whose processes or products contain PFAS in their House Bill 138. These are just a few of the examples. There are also efforts being taken up in other states. Various states last year moved to include PFAS remediation in their enacted budget and appropriations bills during the 2023 session. For example, Oregon enacted Senate Bill 543, which prohibits a person from selling or distributing foodware containers that contain intentionally added PFAS as part of their manufacturing process. A bill in Minnesota was signed into law that requires a pesticide registrant to annually provide a statement that a product does not contain any intentionally added PFAS. That begins in 2026. Maine also passed a law prohibiting the sale of bottled water containing a PFAS contaminant in an amount that exceeds state or federal levels. Ultimately, from these though, and to conclude, given CSG's own internal research, as well as research conducted by others at Multistate, NCSL, Fiscal Note, we expect in 2024 to see more bills introduced that aim to regulate PFAS in consumer products, packaging, firefighting foam and equipment, as well as those that seek to further PFAS remediation efforts. And we also anticipate that more states will introduce legislation establishing committees to study PFAS remediation or the effects of PFAS on public health, in particular, along with the environment. And that concludes it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Chris, would you be, where are you based? Just so I have some kind.
New York.
You're in New York. I mean, would you be the point person if any of us had any questions about some of these efforts in other states? Would you be the guy that we would contact?
Yes, I am the Energy and Environmental Policy Fellow.
I did
there.
have one question on this PFAS relief fund out of Massachusetts that specifically is a relief fund to assist farmers. Is that, you said introduced, I mean, is that actually passed? Is there an actual fund? And if so, how much is in that fund? Because Massachusetts, in some respects, is comparable to Maryland in terms of population, et cetera. Did that actually pass or was simply introduced?
As of October, I believe it was still introduced. I'll have to confirm the precise figure of the amount that's put in the fund, and I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, that was that caught my eye. But okay, any other questions from yes, Vice Chair Kagan?
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher, and thanks for your work. I don't get it. Tell me why a manufacturer would add PFAS after manufacturing. Is there something that makes it better to them? You referenced that a couple of times.
Yes, and sorry for not being clear. So for various manufacturers, and this has already come up in terms of debate in various state legislatures and in federal discussions about how to regulate these chemicals, there are manufacturers that inadvertently incorporate PFAS into their manufacturing process, and oftentimes they don't even know if they're doing it. there are manufacturers that intentionally add PFAS or incorporate it as part of their manufacturing process. And again, as the last presentation mentioned, PFAS represents a category of over or around 7,000 chemicals. So a lot of these compounds are ones that add durability to their products, if that's what the product requires, and makes it quality. And some of them have been linked to toxic outcomes for human health, and some have not. Some have not yet. So, but there have been instances, and I'm thinking of testimony that I heard last December at a PFAS panel about manufacturers in Maine, and they felt, put upon by current regulation that cast a broad brush over this very large class of chemicals, and felt sort of blindsided by the fact that their manufacturing process, which has been around for some time, was now all of a sudden under, scrutiny, and they didn't possess the technical capacity to begin, parsing their manufacturing process and removing these individual chemical components from their products.
Okay, additional questions? Okay, thank you to CSG for coming in today, and we got your contact info. And folks, yeah, we have one more bill, Senator Washington's bill. Do we have to break?
Yes.
Okay, so we need to take a 5-minute break, and then we have one final bill for today. Senator Washington, and so come back here in about 5 minutes, and we, I believe, have